Wyoming Territory. Autumn 1877. One night took everything she had, her home, her family, and every reason she had left to trust anyone. She was shaking in the dark, blood soaking through her dress, when the stranger's hand steadied her shoulder. "I've never slept beside a man," she whispered, eyes locked on his, raw and unguarded. Gideon didn't blink. His voice came low and absolutely certain. "You're safe with me. Keep watching this story. We'll not let you go." Wyoming Territory. Autumn 1877. The fire got everything. The barn went first. She heard it before she saw it. That deep, low crack of timber giving way, like the earth itself had split open. Then the roof of the house fell in, with a sound like thunder rolling flat across the prairie. Orange light flooded the sky. It turned the entire world the color of blood. Evelyn Thorne was 22 years old, and until that night she had never run from anything in her life. Now she ran. She didn't know where she was going. Her legs just moved, churning through the dry grass, her boots slamming against the hard ground. The calico dress she'd worn to supper was soaked through on her left side, dark and warm and heavy. She told herself it was sweat. She knew it wasn't. The grays had caught her just below the ribs. One of the masked riders. He'd fired wide in the chaos, but wide had still been close enough to tear a line across her skin. It burned like a brand pressed flat. Every step sent a fresh pulse of pain shooting up through her chest. She didn't stop. Behind her, the homestead roared. She didn't look back. She already knew what was there. Her father, Jacob Thorne, was on the porch where he'd fallen. Her brothers, Eli and Cole, were in the yard. She had seen them go down before she ran. She had stood there for one terrible second, frozen in the doorway, watching, and then some deep animal part of her brain had taken over and told her legs to move. So she moved. The prairie stretched out ahead, dark and vast and indifferent. The wind came low off the mountains to the west, carrying the first real bite of winter. It wasn't even October yet. Wyoming didn't care much about calendars. Evie pressed her palm flat against her side and kept going. The grass was tall out here, waist-high in places, dry as paper, after a long summer, with too little rain. It hissed against her legs as she pushed through it. A good fire would take the whole plain if the wind shifted wrong. She thought about that, thought about the flames behind her and the wind at her back, and then she stopped thinking about it, because there was nothing she could do, and thinking about it would slow her down. Her father used to say a person's mind was their best weapon on the frontier. Right now, her mind was the only weapon she had left. She pushed on for what felt like a long time. The pain in her side deepened from a burn to something duller, colder. That worried her more than the burning. She knew enough about wounds so that when they stopped hurting, it wasn't because they'd gotten better. She reached a low ridge, and her legs gave out. She didn't fall so much as fold. Her knees hit the ground first, then her palms. She caught herself in the dry grass, breathing hard. Below the ridge, a creek bed ran shallow and dry through the plain. There was a giant oak tree at the bank, old and thick-trunked. Its branches spread out wide like arms thrown open. The last few leaves clung to the upper branches. The rest had already gone. Evie crawled to it. She got herself up against the base of the trunk and sat there with her back pressed to the bark and her legs stretched out in front of her. She looked down at her side. The calico was soaked clear through, the fabric dark and stiff where it had dried and wet, and fresh where it hadn't. She pressed her palm against it again, harder this time. The sky above the ridge was still orange. The fire was still going. She sat there in the failing light and let herself feel it, all of it, for exactly as long as she could afford to. She gave herself 10 breaths. She counted them out, slow and even the way her mother had taught her when she was small. 1, 2, her father was gone. 3, Eli was gone. 4, Cole was gone. 5, the homestead was gone. 6, the cattle were scattered or dead. 7, There were men on horseback somewhere behind her. 8. She was alone on the Wyoming plain with a wound in her side, and no horse and no gun. 9. She got to 9 and stopped counting. She had to stay awake. She told herself that once, firm and clear in her own head. Then she tilted her head back against the bark and watched the darkening sky and listened to the prairie settle around her. Crickets, somewhere, whined through the grass, the distant, diminishing sound of the fire. She lasted maybe 10 minutes. Then everything went dim and quiet, and she was gone. She didn't hear the hooves. Gideon Mercer had been tracking 3 strays since mid-afternoon. They were Hereford cattle, branded with the mark of a small homestead operation out near Sweetwater. He'd spotted them drifting south during his own ride and had turned to follow, 'cause that was the kind of man he was. He didn't explain it, didn't think about it much. A stray animal was someone's livelihood. You brought it back. He was a lean man, 32 years old, broad through the shoulders and quiet in his movements. He rode a black stallion named Merlin, who was 17 hands tall and had a temperament like cold iron, steady and unbothered by most things. Gideon had owned him for 6 years. They understood each other. He'd lost the strays when dusk came on. The light dropped fast this time of year, and the plain swallowed them up. He'd pulled Merlin to a stop and taken his bearings, deciding whether to camp for the night or push on south, when he saw it, smoke. Not cook fire smoke, not the thin gray thread of a chimney. This was a column, wide and rolling, brick red at its base where the flames were still feeding, black at the top where it met the sky. It sat on the southern horizon, maybe 3 miles out. Gideon looked at it for a moment, then he turned Merlin and rode toward it. He didn't hurry. A man who hurried toward a fire without knowing what he was riding into was a man who ended up dead or useless. He kept Merlin at a steady lope and watched the horizon as he moved, watching for riders, watching for movement, reading the plain the way a man reads a room he's just walked into, slow and careful and without showing it. He smelled the fire before he saw the buildings, or what was left of them. The homestead was a ruin. The house had come down on itself. The barn was still standing on one wall, barely. There were animals loose in the yard. 2 horses pressing against the fence line in terror. A dog running circles in the firelight. There were shapes on the ground that Gideon studied without getting close to them. He'd seen enough in his years as a scout and a deputy to know what they were without needing to confirm it. 3 men, all down, none moving. He scanned the yard, the ridgeline, the road coming in from the north. No riders visible. Whoever had done this was already gone, or far enough out that they weren't a present danger. He moved around the perimeter of the yard, staying back. And that was when Merlin's ears went forward and the horse turned his head toward the south ridge. Gideon trusted the horse's nose more than his own eyes in low light. He rode south. He saw the oak tree first, then the shape at the base of it. He pulled Merlin up short and sat still, watching. The shape didn't move. He studied the ground between him and the tree. No one else nearby. He swung down from the saddle and dropped the reins, letting Merlin stand, and walked forward slowly. It was a young woman. She was sitting up against the trunk, legs out, head back. Her dress was dark with blood along her left side, and her face was pale in the last gray light of dusk. Young, maybe early 20s. Brown hair, most of it pulled loose from whatever she'd had it pinned in. Her right hand was still pressed flat against her side. He crouched in front of her. "Hey," she didn't respond. He reached out and put 2 fingers to the side of her throat. Pulse there, thin but steady. He put his hand in front of her mouth. Breath, shallow and even. She was alive. He looked at her side. The wound was a graze, he could see that. Long and ragged, where the bullet had dragged across the skin, but it hadn't gone in. She'd lost blood, though. Too much for the distance she'd likely covered. Her skin was cold when he touched her wrist. He didn't waste time. He'd had a canteen on his saddle, a bedroll, and in his saddlebag, a clean strip of linen he kept for field dressings. He retrieved all of it. He worked fast, pressing the linen firm against the wound, binding it around her midsection, with strips torn from the edge of his own shirt. It wasn't elegant. It didn't need to be. It just needed to hold. He was tying off the last strip when she came around. She came back fast. One moment, she was still. The next, her eyes opened, and she pulled in a sharp breath, and her whole body went rigid. Her free hand grabbed his wrist, sudden and hard, and she tried to pull away. Easy. He kept his voice flat and even. I'm not going to hurt you. She scrambled back against the trunk, getting her feet under her, looking at him with the kind of wide-eyed calculation that told him she was already thinking about whether she could run. Smart girl. I found you unconscious, he said. He didn't move closer. He stayed where he was, crouched, keeping himself low and still. There's a wound on your left side. I've bandaged it. You lost blood. You need to stay still, she stared at him. Her breathing was fast and shallow. Her eyes moved over him, over his face, his hands, his gun belt, the horse standing behind him in the dark. Who are you? Her voice came out rough, like speaking took effort. Gideon Mercer. I was tracking strays when I saw the smoke. He paused. I went to the homestead first. I saw what happened there. Something crossed her face. It wasn't shock. She was past shock. It was something older and heavier than that. Are there riders still out, he asked. I don't know. She swallowed. There were 6 of them, maybe 7. Masked. They came in from the north road just after supper. She stopped. Started again. My father. My brothers. He let her have the silence. She looked down at the bandage wrapped around her side. Back up at him. You did this? Yes, you a doctor? No, she pulled a breath in through her nose, steadying herself. You're not one of them. It wasn't a question, but he answered it anyway. I'm not one of them. She stayed where she was for another moment, back against the tree, watching him. Then, slowly, the rigid line of her shoulders came down, just a fraction. I'm Evie, she said. Evelyn Thorne. All right, Evie. He stood up slowly, making sure she could track his movements. There's shelter I know of, a trapper's cabin up in the Wind River foothills, maybe 4 hours' ride. Whoever burned your homestead, they'll come back to check for survivors. We can't stay on this plane. She pushed herself to her feet. She didn't ask for help, and he didn't offer any. She made it upright, one hand pressed to her side, jaw set, and stood there swaying slightly, while the blood came back to her legs. My horse? She said. They took the horses. You'll ride with me. She looked at Merlin. The horse regarded her with enormous dark eyes, completely unbothered. He's calm, Gideon said. He won't throw you. She crossed to the horse and stood beside him for a moment, then put her foot in the stirrup and started to pull herself up. She made it halfway and went still, her face going white. He stepped forward and put a steadying hand under her elbow, nothing more, and she didn't pull away. She got herself up into the saddle. He swung up behind her, reaching past to take the reins, and turned Merlin north and west toward the high, dark silhouette of the mountains. She sat straight-backed in front of him, not leaning, holding herself up through pure stubbornness they rode. The fire on the southern horizon burned lower as they went, then lower still. After an hour, it was just a faint glow behind them. Ahead, the Wind River Range rose black against a sky coming thick with stars. The temperature was dropping. Gideon could feel it in his hands on the reins. Evie said nothing for a long time. He didn't push it. Then, after a while, she said quietly, they wore masks. They usually do. Someone hired them. Usually the way it goes. She was quiet again. He felt her shift slightly in the saddle, a small adjustment to ease the pressure on her side. I know who it was, she said. He waited. Senator Orson Sterling. She said the name like she was putting it down somewhere solid, setting it in place. He's been after our water rights for 2 years. My father wouldn't sell. 3 weeks ago, a man came to the homestead with a letter from Sterling's lawyer. My father told him to get off the property. She paused. I guess Sterling took that as his final answer. Gideon knew the name. Most people in Wyoming Territory did. Sterling had money and reach and a reputation for getting what he wanted. He'd heard things, over the years, rumors in towns and trading posts, about how his land deals tended to go. But rumors were just talk. "You have proof?" he asked. Not yet. The word yet sat out there in the cold air between them. He looked at her, at the back of her head, the loose dark hair, the straight spine. "Most people in your position," he said, "would be thinking about where to go." "I'm thinking about where to go," she said. "I'm just also thinking about what to do when I get there." They rode on in silence. The stars spread wide overhead. An owl crossed in front of them, low and soundless. Merlin's hooves fell steady, and even on the hard ground. Gideon thought about the three shapes he'd seen in the yard of the Thorne homestead. He thought about what it had cost this girl, this 22-year-old with blood on her dress and iron in her spine, to still be upright and moving. And thinking about what came next, he thought about what it meant that she'd survived. She hadn't asked for his help beyond what was necessary. She hadn't cried in front of him, hadn't made herself small. She was sitting in his saddle with a graze wound on her side, and her family dead behind her, and she was already planning. After another while, she spoke again. "Why did you come to the fire?" "I told you. I saw the smoke. You could have ridden the other way." He didn't answer. Right away. The wind moved through the grass around them. "A person's life is worth turning toward," he said finally. "That's all." She seemed to think about that. They were into the foothills. When she spoke again, her voice low and tired. "Do you believe in justice, Mr. Mercer?" It was a real question. He treated it that way. "I believe in it as a thing that has to be built," he said. "It doesn't just exist. You have to make it." She nodded slowly, like he'd confirmed something she'd already suspected. The trapper's cabin came into view around 2 hours before midnight, tucked up against a rock face in a fold of the mountain. Small, dark, and cold, but solid. The walls would hold, and the roof would keep the wind out. Gideon helped Evie down from the saddle. She was moving carefully now, the injury stiffening up in the cold, and when her feet hit the ground, she held the stirrup leather for a moment before letting go. He got the cabin open and got her inside and got a fire started. She sat on the narrow cot and watched the flames take hold in the hearth with hollow, exhausted eyes. He looked at her in the firelight. She looked back at him. "Whoever you are," he said, and his voice was quiet and even and absolutely certain, "your life is the most sacred thing on this land tonight." Evie Thorne looked at him for a long moment. Then she nodded once. Just once. Outside, the first snow of the season had begun to fall, silent and steady, covering the foothills in white, covering the tracks behind them, covering the smoke-stained sky over what had been the Thorne homestead. Inside the little cabin, the fire burned. The cabin held. That was the first thing to be grateful for. The walls were old, rough-hewn log chinked with dried mud and moss, and some of the chinking had gone to dust over the years, but the structure was solid. The roof didn't leak. The door fit its frame. Whoever had built it, they had built it to last. Gideon got the fire up to a proper burn, and then turned to look at the room. There wasn't much to it. A stone hearth on the north wall, a wooden table, 2 chairs, a narrow cot against the east wall, with an old bearskin folded at the foot of it. Shelves on the wall above held some rusted tins, a candle stub, a coil of rope, the kind of place a man stopped for a night and moved on from. Tonight, it would have to be enough. Evie was sitting on the cot, where he'd put her, still in her bloody calico dress, watching the fire. She hadn't said anything in the last 10 minutes of the ride, and hadn't said anything since they'd come inside. She wasn't in shock, he didn't think. Her eyes were too focused for shock. She was just somewhere inside herself, in that private place a person goes when grief is too big and too fresh to hold in the open. He left her there and went to check on Merlin. He'd tied the horse to the iron ring set in the rock face outside, and now he got him under the small lean-to at the south end of the cabin, out of the wind, and checked his hooves and gave him the last of the grain from the saddlebag. The wind had started picking up in the last hour of their ride, cold and steady from the northwest, carrying the wet smell of coming snow. He stood outside for a moment in the dark and listened to the mountains. Then he went back in. "I need to look at that wound," he said. Evie looked up from the fire. She'd had that hour on horseback to rest, and her color had come back a little, but not enough. The left side of her dress was stiff with dried blood where the bandage had bled through. "It needs to be cleaned properly," he said. "I did a field dressing in the dark. That's not the same as cleaned and closed." She nodded once, short and tight. "All right." He pulled one of the chairs to the side of the cot and sat down, angling himself to the firelight. He'd found a half-empty bottle of whiskey in the back of the shelf, which was lucky, and he had the last of his clean linen from the saddlebag. He set everything out on the floor beside him, working slow and deliberate, so she could see exactly what he was reaching for, and why. He started to lean forward to unwrap the old bandage. She pulled back, fast, instinctive. Her back hit the wall, and her breath came in sharp, and her eyes went wide, fixed on him with the flat, cornered look of an animal that has been backed into a corner and is deciding whether to bite. He stopped immediately. He sat back in the chair. He didn't reach for her, didn't try to talk her out of it. He just sat back and gave her the space and let her breathe. Then he reached down to his gun belt. He unbuckled it slow, with both hands where she could see them, and he lifted the whole rig off his hip, holster and Colt and all, and reached over and set it on the table. He pushed it to the far edge, away from both of them. Then he put his hands on his knees, open, palms up. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said. He kept his voice flat and steady, no particular softness in it, just plain. "That gun's on the table, and that's where it stays. I'm going to clean this wound because it needs cleaning, and then I'm going to sit in that other chair and sleep. And in the morning we'll figure out what comes next. That's all." Evie stared at the Colt on the table. Then she looked at him. The panic was still there in her eyes. But underneath it was something else, something measuring. She was looking at him the same way. She'd looked at Merlin out on the plain, working out whether she could trust what she was seeing. He waited. Slowly, the tight line of her shoulders eased. "All right," she said again. "Quieter this time." He worked as quickly as he could, and as carefully as he knew how. The wound was uglier under proper inspection. Long and ragged, maybe 3 inches across the ribs, deep enough to need attention, but shallow enough that no organs were involved. She'd been lucky, and she probably knew it. She sat still while he cleaned it, biting the inside of her cheek when it pulled, making no sound. He laid a fresh pad of linen over it and wrapped it firm. "That'll hold until we get you to a proper doctor," he said. "How far is Sweetwater?" "From here. Day and a half, maybe 2. Depends on the weather." As if the mountains had been listening, the wind hit the cabin wall right then with a sound like a fist. The fire ducked sideways in the draft and came back up. From outside, Gideon heard Merlin shift and stamp. The blizzard didn't announce itself. It just arrived. Within an hour, the wind had gone from bad to something else entirely. Snow came horizontal against the shuttered windows. The temperature in the cabin dropped even with the fire burning, and the fire was burning as high as Gideon dared without risking a chimney spark. He'd added the last of the wood from the lean-to stack, which wasn't much. He watched Evie across the room. She'd laid down on the cot, which was good. She needed rest, but she was shaking. Steadily, continuously, her whole body moving in small convulsive tremors under the thin wool blanket she'd pulled over herself. The bearskin was folded at the foot of the cot. She'd pushed it aside. Maybe she hadn't wanted to reach for it. Maybe she was too tired to bother. He crossed the room and picked up the bearskin and spread it over her without asking. She didn't open her eyes, but the shaking didn't slow. He went and fed another piece of wood to the fire, stood in front of it with his arms crossed, and watched the flames and thought. It was the blood loss. That was the core of it. She'd lost enough that her body was struggling to hold its heat, and struggling bodies drew heat away from the extremities first. The cabin was cold. The fire couldn't do enough from across the room. She needed warmth applied directly. He stood there for a while. Then he pulled the second chair close to the cot and sat in it, and put his hand to her forehead. She was cold, too cold. Her lips had gone pale. He made his decision the way he made most of his decisions. Quickly, without fanfare because it was the right one, and there wasn't time for anything else. Evie. He touched her shoulder lightly. She opened her eyes, glassy and slow. I need to get you warm, he said. The fire's not enough. Your body temperature's dropped too far. He held her gaze. I'm going to lie beside you and share heat. That's all it is, you understand? She looked at him. The shaking made her voice come out uneven. You going to explain that before or after? Before, he said. Always before. She was quiet for a moment. The wind slammed into the cabin again, rattling the door in its frame. Then do it, she said. He kept his coat on, kept his boots on, kept everything on. He lay down on the narrow cot beside her, on top of the wool blanket, and pulled the heavy bearskin quilt over them both. He was careful about the angles, careful about the space between them, making sure she had room and wasn't pinned. He could feel the cold radiating off her, even through the layers between them. Evie lay on her back, staring at the ceiling. The shaking hadn't stopped. He listened to the blizzard outside, snow building against the walls. Merlin somewhere under the lean-to, stoic as a stone. After a while, Evie spoke. Her voice was just above a whisper, but in that small cabin it carried clearly over the sound of the wind. I've never slept beside a man. He turned his head enough to look at her profile. Her jaw was set. She'd set it straight, without apology, without trying to make it into something smaller than it was. He pulled the bearskin quilt up, closer around her shoulders. He kept his voice as even and plain as the flat prairie they'd ridden across. You're safe with me. She didn't respond right away. The fire crackled. The storm pushed against the walls. Then he felt the rigid tension in her body shift, not disappearing, but changing quality. She was still afraid. She just wasn't only afraid anymore. He looked back at the ceiling. It wasn't nothing, what she'd just said. He understood that. Not every person found themselves in a trapper's cabin with a stranger in a blizzard, and not every stranger treated the weight of that moment with the seriousness it deserved. She had trusted him with something real. The least he could do was receive it plainly. Physical closeness in a moment like this wasn't a possession or advantage. He knew some men who didn't understand that. Men who would look at a situation like this one and see opportunity in the vulnerability of it. Those men were something specific and ugly, and he had no patience for them. This was two people in a storm, keeping each other alive. That was the whole of it. He stayed awake a long time, listening to the blizzard and monitoring her breathing. Slowly, over the course of an hour, the shaking lessened. Her breathing deepened. Her body temperature came up. He could feel it even through the blanket, a gradual steadying. Around what he figured was 2 in the morning, Evie Thorne fell into a real sleep. He stayed where he was and kept watch. The snow kept coming. By the small hours, her breathing was even, and her color had come back enough that he could see it in the firelight. He got up carefully, added the last piece of wood to the fire, and went back and sat in the chair beside the cot. He pulled his coat closer and sat with his arms on his knees and his eyes on the door and let the night pass. He thought about the homestead, the 3 shapes in the yard. He thought about Sterling. He thought about a young woman insisting on the word yet. Outside, the storm built and then, somewhere around 4 in the morning, began to quiet. The wind dropped first, then the sound of snow against the shutters softened. By the time a pale gray light began to show at the edges of the window frame, the blizzard had run itself out, leaving the mountain in silence. Gideon sat in his chair and watched Evie sleep and waited for the day to start. Whatever came next, they would face it in the light. The fever arrived with the dawn. Gideon had seen it coming. A wound that size, improperly cleaned in the field, then hours in the cold, then a night of the body fighting to regulate its own temperature. By the time gray morning light came through the gaps in the shutters, Evie's forehead was hot under his palm, and her sleep had gone restless, her head moving side to side, murmuring things he couldn't make out. He kept the fire going. He found one of the rusted tins on the shelf and got snow from outside and melted it and got water into her in small amounts. When she surfaced enough to swallow, he changed the dressing on her side, which was clean underneath at least. No infection yet. That was the one good thing. Then he sat back in his chair and watched the light change and waited. Fever was a fight. The body ran on its own. There wasn't much a man could do except keep the patient warm and watered and try to keep the fire from going out. He'd done this before. Soldiers mostly, during the years. He'd ridden as a scout for the army, out of Fort Bridger. Fever was patient. You just had to be more patient than it was. Merlin knocked against the lean-to wall outside, wanting attention. Gideon went out and checked on him, broke the thin skin of ice that had formed in the water bucket overnight, gave him the last of the grain. The world outside was white and still. Snow lay 2 feet deep in the open ground and drifted higher against the north faces of the rocks. The sky had gone pale blue and cloudless, the way Wyoming skies did after a big storm, as if the blizzard had scoured everything clean. He stood in the cold and looked at it for a moment. Beautiful country. He had always thought so, even in the difficult years. Maybe especially then. He went back inside. Evie broke her fever late in the afternoon. He was sitting at the table, cleaning his revolver when she went still. The restlessness just stopped. Her breathing evened out. He crossed to the cot and checked her forehead and found it cool and damp. She was sleeping properly, now deeply, her face relaxed for the first time since he'd found her. He went back to his chair and let her sleep another 3 hours. She woke up when the light was going amber in the west. She lay still for a moment, looking at the ceiling, getting her bearings. Then she turned her head and looked at him. "How long?" she asked. "Fever broke about 3 hours ago. You've been out since last night." She sat up slowly, testing each movement. She pressed a hand to her side, checking the bandage. Then she swung her legs over the edge of the cot and sat there, looking at the floor, running her tongue over her dry lips. "Water," he said. "Please." He poured her a cup from the pot he'd kept warm at the edge of the fire and brought it to her. She drank the whole thing without stopping. He refilled it. She drank half of that. "The storm's past," he said. "Ground's deep with snow, but the sky's clear. We can move in the morning, early. I want to get you to Sweetwater, find a doctor, get that wound seen to properly." He expected her to nod, to agree. It was the obvious next step, the logical one, the one that made straightforward sense. She looked up at him. "I'm not going to Sweetwater." He held her gaze. "I need to go to Oakhaven," she said. "I need to testify against Sterling." He set the water pot back on the hearth and straightened up and turned to look at her with his full attention. "Oakhaven," he said. "That's where the district courthouse is. That's where Sterling operates. That's where any legal action against him would have to originate. I know where the courthouse is. Then you know it's the right place to go." He pulled the second chair around and sat in it, facing her. He rested his forearms on his knees. He looked at her for a long moment, this 22-year-old woman in a torn and blood-stained dress who had buried a fever in one day and was already planning her next move. "Sterling controls Oakhaven," he said. "The mayor is in his pocket. The town marshal draws a check from one of Sterling's land companies. The circuit judge owes him a favor going back 10 years, maybe longer." He paused. "You walk into that courthouse without the right backing and the right evidence, and you'll be arrested by nightfall on whatever charge they decide to invent. Trespassing on Sterling's land. Theft, arson. They'll name it." Evie sat with that. She wasn't flinching from it. "I have evidence," she said. "I told you. I know. Sterling ordered those riders. I know he wanted our water rights. Knowing and proving are different things on opposite ends of a very long road. Then I'll walk the road." He exhaled through his nose. The fire popped. Outside, Merlin shifted weight under the lean. 2. You are the most stubborn person I have met in recent memory, he said. You haven't known me long enough to have a proper sample. He stood up and went to his saddlebag, which was hanging from a peg on the wall. He needed to check the provisions, count what they had, start figuring the route. His hands worked through the bag automatically, while his mind was still on the problem of Oakhaven and the problem of this girl, who seemed entirely unaware that she was supposed to be frightened into submission. He found the food supplies. A small amount of jerked beef, some hardtack, coffee enough for 2 more mornings. He found the box of extra cartridges. He found the folded piece of oilcloth he kept maps in. And then his hand hit something at the very bottom of the bag, something small and solid, caught in the corner seam where it had been sitting undisturbed for a long time. He pulled it out. He looked at it. It lay in his palm, small and unremarkable. A deputy sheriff's badge, 6-pointed, stamped tin, tarnished nearly black. One point was bent from where it had been thrown against a wall 5 years ago. The pin on the back was rusted half through. He stood with his back to Evie for a moment. Then he closed his hand around it and turned around. She was watching him. She'd seen something change in his face, and she was watching him the way she watched. Most things direct and patient. He could put the badge back in the bag. He almost did. Instead, he sat down and set it on the table between them. She looked at it, then at him. Is that yours? It was. She waited. He hadn't talked about this. Not in 5 years. Not to anyone. The words sat in his chest like stones, and he turned them over for a moment, feeling their weight. I was a deputy out of Laramie County, he said. Before that, I scouted for the Army, 8 years. I was good at reading terrain, good at tracking, good at not getting killed in places where that was easy to do. I believed in law, genuinely. Thought. The system was imperfect but correctable. Thought if good men worked inside it, it would become what it was supposed to be. Evie was still watching him. She hadn't moved. 5 years ago, I was riding a circuit between 2 ranching settlements south of the county line. I came across a family camped in a river bottom. Man, woman, 4 kids. They were terrified and moving fast, and the children were half-starved. He stopped, ran a thumb across the edge of the badge. I asked around at the next town. The family had escaped from an indenture arrangement that was legal on paper and slavery in practice. The man who owned the arrangement had reported them as fugitives. There was a posted notice. He set the badge flat on the table. I brought them in, he said. I handed them over to the county marshal in good faith, because that was the law. Because I believed in the law. He paused. I believed they would receive due process, a hearing, that the circumstances of their situation would be considered. Evie's eyes hadn't left his face. They were hanged. 2 days later, he said, no trial, no hearing. The man who owned their indenture was on good terms with the county judge. The marshal who I handed them to was on good terms with the man. He picked the badge up and looked at it. I went to the site afterward. All 6 of them. The mother and the children, too. The fire was low. He should have added wood. He didn't move. I took the badge off that same day, he said. I threw it against a wall in the county building. Then I walked out, got Merlin, and rode north. He looked across at her. I've been moving since. Evie sat quiet for a long time. The last light faded from the window. The cabin went darker, and the firelight became the main thing in the room. He could hear his own breathing. You trusted the system, she said, and the system failed them. I failed them, he said. The system gave me the chance. You didn't string them up. I delivered them to the people who did. That's close enough. She was quiet again. She looked at the badge on the table. Is that why you don't want to take me to Oakhaven? Because you don't believe it will work? He thought about that honestly. I don't believe it will work the way you think it will, he said. Sterling owns that legal apparatus the same way that indenture owner owned that county marshal. Justice in those walls is available to the people with the money to buy it. That's the truth of it, Evie. That's what I've seen. Then we change what's in those walls. That's not a simple thing. I know it isn't simple. Her voice was flat and clear. My family is dead on the ground back there. I know exactly how difficult this is. I'm not asking for simple. She picked up the badge, turned it over in her hands, looking at the tarnished tin, the bent point, the rusted pin. But here's what I've been thinking about since I woke up. Sterling ordered my father killed. He ordered my brothers killed. He tried to have me killed. He's going to do this to someone else. Some other family on some other piece of ground he decides he wants. She set the badge back down between them. If I run to Sweetwater and find a doctor, and keep my head low and try to start over somewhere else, he gets to keep doing it, to whoever is next. Gideon looked at her across the table. The law in this territory treats people differently based on who they are, she went on. Based on their money and their name and their skin and who they know. I've seen it my whole life. My father saw it. Everyone sees it. She pressed her palm flat on the table beside the badge. That's not just or right. And the only way it changes is if people who've been wronged by it refuse to disappear quietly. He was silent. She wasn't talking only about herself. She was talking about the family in the river bottom. She was talking about everyone who had ever had their rights trampled by a system designed to protect the powerful and discard everyone else. She was talking about a principle worth more than safety. He had believed in that principle once. He had wanted to believe in it so badly that he had trusted an institution that hadn't earned that trust, and people had died for it. But abandoning the principle wasn't the answer. He could see that clearly enough now, sitting in a cold cabin with this woman across the table. What he had done wrong wasn't believing in justice. What he had done wrong was believing the existing structures were already justice, when they were only supposed to be working toward it. There was a difference, an enormous one he had paid 5 years of his life learning. He picked up the badge. He turned it in his fingers for a long moment. The tarnish was deep enough that the tin underneath showed only in the corners. Sterling will have men watching the main roads, he said. We'd need to come in from the south through the canyon country. It would add a day and a half. Evie looked at him. There's also the matter of evidence, he continued. Your testimony alone won't be enough, not in a court Sterling controls. We'd need documents, witnesses, something that can't be buried. That means work before we walk through those courthouse doors. Then we do the work, she said. He set the badge down on the table between them. That badge has been at the bottom of my bag for 5 years, he said. Evie looked at it, then at him. You've been carrying it anyway, she said. He hadn't thought of it that way. He considered whether she was right. He decided after a moment that she probably was. He reached over and picked the badge up and turned it between his fingers one more time. The bent point, the rusted pin. 5 years of sitting in the dark bottom of a saddlebag going nowhere. He set it on the table again, face up this time. Oak Haven is roughly 4 days south, he said. If the weather holds and we move early, we'll need to restock provisions. I know a settlement in the foothills, a trapper who trades fairly. All right. Your wound needs another 2 days rest before you can ride hard, which means we leave the day after tomorrow. That gives us a day to plan the route and figure out what we're riding into. She nodded. Practical, straightforward, already moving forward in her head. He looked at her across the table in the firelight. This woman who had crawled through a burning prairie, who had survived a blizzard, who had broken a fever in a single day, who was sitting here, telling him they were going to walk into the lion's den together. He stood up and went to the fire and added the last of the wood. Get some more sleep, he said. You're still not fully right, and I need you steady. She stretched out on the cot and pulled the bearskin over herself. Gideon, she said. He looked at her. What happened to that family, she said, quiet and certain. That was not your fault alone to carry. The men who hanged them carry it, the judge and the marshal, and the system that let them. You made a mistake of faith. That's different from what they did. She held his eyes. I want you to know, I think that he didn't answer. But he stayed awake a long time after she closed her eyes, sitting in the chair by the fire, and he turned the badge over in his palm one more time before he set it in his breast pocket, close to his chest, and sat back to watch the night pass. They had a long road ahead. They had work to do. They left the cabin before first light. Gideon had them up. At 4 in the morning, the fire banked down to coals, everything packed and loaded onto Merlin before the sky started to change. He wanted distance from the trapper's cabin before full daylight. Whoever was looking for them would work the obvious routes first, the main trails, the valley floors, the creek beds that ran south toward Oakhaven, which meant Gideon had mapped them onto the high stuff, the mountain passes that cut through the Wind River Range, east of the obvious roads. Harder going, slower, colder at elevation, but harder to follow and harder to see from below. Evie had been up before he called her. She was already dressed, sitting at the table with the map spread in front of her and the candle stub burned nearly flat, tracing routes with her finger in the dim light. She hadn't asked him to show her the map the night before. She'd just found it and read it herself. He noticed. He didn't say anything. They moved through the first pass by mid-morning. The snow was deep up here, thigh-deep in the drifts, and Merlin pushed through it steadily, while Gideon led him on foot to spare the horse's legs. Evie walked beside him, her breath clouding the cold air, her boots soaked through within the first hour. She didn't complain about it. The mountains were something up close, massive and indifferent, all gray rock and white snow, and the dark silhouettes of lodgepole pines. A hawk circled the ridge to the west, riding thermals in long, lazy loops. The world up here felt emptied of people, stripped down to its basic elements, rock and sky and cold and the sound of wind moving through the pines. Gideon watched the terrain the same way he always did, reading it constantly, checking sight lines, noting the places where a man could stand without being skylined and still see down into the pass. He'd scouted enough country in enough years that it was automatic now. He wasn't looking for anything specific. He just kept his eyes moving. They stopped at noon in the shelter of a rock overhang, out of the wind, and ate hardtack and jerked beef and drank water from the canteen. Evie sat on a flat rock and worked one of her boots off and wrung out her sock and put it back on. She did it efficiently, without fuss. "How's the side?" he asked. "Tight. Not bad." "Tell me if that changes. I will." He believed her. She was the kind of person who understood that accurate information was more useful than reassurance. She wouldn't lie to him about her condition to seem capable. She already knew she was capable. They'd been riding and walking for about 6 hours, and she hadn't flagged, hadn't asked to slow down, hadn't asked how much farther. She just kept pace and kept her eyes open and kept moving. He thought about what to say next. "I want to teach you to shoot," he said. She looked up from the sock she was wringing. "The revolver," he said. "You should know how to handle one. We've got Kane's men somewhere behind us or below us or both. And you carrying no weapon and no working knowledge of one is a liability I'd like to remove." She pulled her boot back on. "I've shot a rifle, my father's, but not a revolver. Different mechanics. Same principle." He reached down and unholstered the Colt. He checked the cylinder, confirmed the loads, then held it out to her grip first. "Let's start now. We've got time while Merlin rests." She took the gun. She handled it, carefully, not tentatively, but with the particular caution of someone who respects what a thing can do. She turned it in her hands, getting the weight of it. "It's heavier than I thought," she said. 6.5 pounds empty. Point of balance is in front of the cylinder. Most people pull left when they first shoot one because they're fighting the weight instead of working with it. He moved around beside her, not behind her, beside her. "Grip it firmly, but not tight. You're not trying to crush it. Your trigger finger stays outside the guard until you're ready to fire." She adjusted her grip. He watched her hands. "Good. Now your stance matters more with a revolver than people think. Square your shoulders to the target. Lean slightly forward into it. Put your weight on the balls of your feet, not your heels. He paused. If you're standing flat-footed and a man fires back, you'll flinch backward and your shot goes wild. Forward weight absorbs the surprise of the recoil and keeps your second shot accurate. She set her feet the way he described. He watched her posture change, become more deliberate and grounded. He set up 3 stones on the shelf of rock across from them, spaced 2 feet apart. These are your targets. You're shooting at the middle one first. When you're ready, cock the hammer with your thumb, bring your arm up, line the front sight with the rear notch, and squeeze. Don't pull. Pull makes you anticipate and pull left. She raised the Colt. He watched her take her time. She wasn't rushing. She found the sight picture, held it, and fired. The shot hit the rock face 2 inches right of the middle stone. Close. The recoil jerked her arm up and back. She brought it down and looked at where the shot had landed. Right, he said. You pulled right. Uncommon. Most people pull left. I'm left-handed. He hadn't known that. It explained it. Then square everything to your left side. Dominant hand pulls toward the body's center line. If your center is left of a right-handed shooter, your natural pull goes right. He adjusted. Lead your sight slightly left of where you want to hit. Compensate for it until the muscle memory changes. She fired again. The middle stone jumped off the shelf. She looked at it for a moment. Then she looked at him. He nodded once. Again. She shot the right stone, then the left. Then she looked at the empty shelf and at the spent cylinder and at him. How long did it take you? She asked. To shoot straight, to get good at all of it. The shooting, the tracking, reading the land. He considered the question honestly. Years, he said. The mechanics of shooting you can learn in days. The judgment about when to shoot, how to read the situation before it gets to that point. That's what takes the time. Will you teach me that too? I'll teach you what I can while we ride. She reloaded the Colt from the box of cartridges he handed her. She did it slowly, learning the mechanism. He watched her figure it out, without instruction, her fingers working through the process methodically. I won't be a passenger in my own rescue, she said while she loaded. I want to be useful. I want to be able to do things. I haven't treated you like a passenger. She glanced at him. No, you haven't. That's why I'm telling you this directly. He understood what she was saying. She'd been around men who made assumptions. Men who looked at a woman and mentally subtracted her from the list of capable people without even thinking about it. She was telling him that she saw he wasn't one of those men, and she was asking him to stay that way. He thought about the women he'd known in his scouting years, the ones who ran trading posts and homesteads and raised children and managed livestock and kept accounts, all while the men around them talked about women needing protection. He'd never had much patience for that particular brand of thinking. A person was capable, or they weren't, and it had nothing to do with the shape of them. You can take the rifle off the saddle scabbard when we're moving through the passes, he said. Carry it across your lap. If anyone comes up on us fast, you fire first and explain later. She nodded. That was all she needed. They moved on through the afternoon. He taught her other things as they rode and walked. How to read sign in the snow. The difference between a track that was fresh and one that had softened in the wind. How to look at a ridge line and identify where a man would naturally position himself to watch the valley below. How to build a fire that produced heat without producing visible smoke. How to check a horse for injury when you couldn't afford to have the horse go lame. She absorbed everything. She asked specific questions, the questions of someone actually thinking through the applications rather than just collecting information. When he described reading sign in snow, she asked about tracking in dry country where there was no snow. When he explained fire management, she asked about building a fire inside a rock shelter versus open ground. He found himself thinking harder about things he'd done automatically for years because she asked the kind of questions that required him to explain the underlying reasoning, not just the method. That was its own kind of education, going both ways. By late afternoon, they were through the second pass and descending into a long valley that ran southwest. The trees were denser here, spruce and fir coming in thick on both sides. Merlin picked his way through the snow carefully, ears forward, reading the ground. They stopped at a creek bed where the ice was thin enough to break through for water. While Merlin drank, Evie waded through the snow to the far bank and back again without hesitating, just to see how the footing was. "It's solid under the top layer," she said, coming back. "We could bring him across if we need to." He hadn't asked her to check that. She'd just done it. He watched her come back through the snow, her dress hem soaked and dark, her hair coming loose again from the braid she'd put it in that morning, cheeks red with cold. She moved through the difficult terrain with a practical physical ease. No grace for the sake of it, no performance. Just a person comfortable in their body, doing what needed doing. He looked away before she noticed him looking. They made camp that night in a stand of dense spruce trees off the trail by a quarter-mile. He built the fire low, hidden on three sides by the rocks he arranged around it. They ate the last of the jerked beef and finished the coffee. "Kane's men," she said. "Tell me about them." "Jasper Kane runs a tight crew. 8, maybe 10 men who rotate out depending on the job. Most of them are former Army. Some of them are former outlaws who found that working for a wealthy man was more profitable than working against the law outright." He added a stick to the fire. "Kane himself is the one to be careful of. He's cold and he's methodical, and he doesn't lose his head." "How do you know him by reputation?" "Men in my line of work share information." His name came up in connection with a couple of land disputes down in Colorado Territory, 3-4 years back, both of them resolved in favor of the wealthy party. Both of them involved homesteaders who filed complaints and then stopped filing complaints. She was quiet for a moment. "He won't stop," she said. "It wasn't a question. Not until Sterling tells him to, or we make it impossible for him to continue." She looked at the fire. He looked at her profile. The firelight moved across her face, picking out the line of her jaw, the dark circles under her eyes that hadn't quite gone away since the fever. She was tired, properly tired, and still thinking. Still working through the problem. "You know what I keep thinking about?" she said. "Tell me, my father." She turned a stick in her fingers. He was a hard man. Fair, mostly, but hard. He worked from before dawn until after dark every day of his life, and he expected the same from everyone else on the property. He wasn't, she stopped. Tried again. He wasn't particularly warm, but he was there. Every morning when I came down to start breakfast, he was already at the table with his coffee, going over the day's work in his head. She pushed the stick into the fire. "I keep thinking about that empty table," she said. "That's the thing that keeps coming. Not the fire, not the shooting, just the empty table." Gideon sat with that. He'd lost people. His father, years ago. A fellow scout named Beaumont, who'd ridden with him for 3 years, before a river crossing in a storm took him. He knew how grief worked. It didn't always arrive as the big thing. Sometimes it came as the small, specific absence. The empty chair, the coffee cup sitting unused. "It's real," he said. "What you're feeling. Let it be real." She looked at him. "People tell you to be strong," he said. "Like strength and feeling the loss are opposites. They're not. You can carry both." She studied him for a moment. "You've lost people," she said. "Yes. Did it get easier?" He thought about the honest answer. "It got different. The weight of it changes shape over time. It doesn't go away, but it stops being the only thing you can feel." He met her eyes, and it matters what you do with it. Some people let grief turn them hard and closed off. Some people let it turn them into something better. The choice is real. She looked back at the fire. "Then I know which one I'm choosing," she said. They sat in the quiet of the spruce grove, the fire burning low between them, the stars coming out thick overhead. The cold was clean and deep. Somewhere far off, a wolf called once and went silent. It wasn't romance in any formal sense. There were no declarations, no reaching across the space between them. It was quieter than that. It was two people who had come through hard country together and sat easy in each other's company, which is its own thing entirely, and rarer than most people think. He got up and banked the fire and checked the perimeter and came back and sat in his bedroll across from her. "Get some sleep," he said. "You too," she said. "You've been watching all night, every night, since the cabin. You need rest too." He looked at her. "I'll wake you at 2, she said. "I'll take the watch until dawn." He opened his mouth. "I can do it," she said. "I know the perimeter. I know what to listen for. And you taught me to shoot this morning. Let me be useful." He closed his mouth. Then he lay down and pulled his bedroll around him. 2 o'clock, he said. 2 o'clock, she agreed. He was asleep in 3 minutes. She kept her word. The way station sat at the end of a track so faint and overgrown that Gideon almost missed it twice. He'd known about it in a general way, the way you know about things on the frontier, through second-hand mention, a careful word from a trustworthy source, the kind of information that circulates among people who've needed to move quietly through difficult country. A man he'd ridden with briefly out of Rock Springs 2 years back had mentioned a woman named Montgomery who kept a place in the low hills east of the Green River. He'd described it as discreet and said nothing else, because nothing else needed saying. Gideon found the track by the marker he'd been told to look for. 3 flat stones stacked in a particular way on the east side of a cottonwood at the creek crossing. He turned Merlin south and followed the track through dense scrub oak and box elder for about a mile, and the way station came into view. It wasn't much to look at from the outside. A low, solid house built into the hillside, the back wall actually cut into the slope so the earth itself insulated it. A good-sized stable to the south, well built, with a new roof. A kitchen garden, dormant now under a thin skin of frost. A woodpile stacked 6 feet high against the east wall. Everything neat, everything intentional. A woman stood in the doorway watching them come. She was somewhere in her late 40s. A tall woman with a broad, strong frame and close-cropped, gray hair at her temples. She wore a work dress the color of creek mud, practical and plain, and she had a long-barreled shotgun resting across her forearm in the manner of someone who was neither threatening nor unaware. She watched Gideon and Evie come down the track with level, assessing eyes. Gideon stopped Merlin at the edge of the yard. "Martha Montgomery?" he said. "Who's asking Gideon?" "Mercer. I was told your name by a man called Devereux out of Rock Springs." Appalled, she looked at Evie, at the bandage visible at Evie's side where her coat hung open. Then back at Gideon. "Get the horse in the stable," she said. "Come in through the back." She turned and went inside without waiting to see if they'd follow. The inside of the house was warm and clean and smelled of wood smoke, cooking herbs, and lye soap. The main room served as kitchen, dining area, and sitting room with a large stone hearth that threw good heat. The furniture was mismatched but solid. Books on the shelf above the hearth, a real quantity of them, their spines turned outward in careful order. A quilt in progress on a frame near the window, half finished, the colors deliberate and precise. Martha was at the stove when they came in, stirring something in a heavy pot. She didn't turn around immediately. "Sit down," she said. "Both of you." They sat at the table. She brought over 2 cups of coffee without being asked, set them down, and then sat across from them and looked at Evie with the kind of direct attention that required nothing in return. "What happened to your side?" she asked. "Bullet graze," Evie said. 4 days ago. "A doctor look at it?" "Not yet." Martha stood back up and went to a cabinet on the far wall. She came back with a cloth bag and set it on the table. "Take your coat off and lift your shirt. I've got field medicine enough to know what I'm looking at." Evie looked at her for half a second. Then she did as asked. Martha unwound Gideon's bandage, looked at the wound without comment, cleaned it with something from a brown glass bottle that made Evie's jaw tighten, applied a clean dressing, and rewrapped it with more skill than Gideon had managed in the dark trapper's cabin. The whole thing took 10 minutes. "Healing," Martha said, putting her supplies away. "It'll scar. It won't give you trouble." Thank you, Evie said. Martha sat back down. Who are you running from? Gideon answered. He gave her the shape of it, not all the detail, just what she needed to know. Sterling, Kane, the Thorne homestead, the route they'd taken through the mountain passes. Martha listened without interrupting. When he was done, she nodded once, slowly. Sterling, she said. I know the name. Most people in the territory do. I know more than his name. She wrapped both hands around her own coffee cup. 3 families came through here over the past 2 years. Homesteaders, driven off their land. 2 of them had letters from Sterling's lawyers, and one of them had nothing but burn marks on what she was wearing. She looked at Evie. So I know what his operations look like. Evie looked back at her steadily. How long have you run this place? 11 years. Martha said it plainly, as fact. Before that I was in Missouri. Before that I was in Mississippi, where I was not free to be, where I chose to be. She said it without drama, just as the sequence of her life stated truthfully. I came west and I built this place, and I decided that whatever I had, I would share with whoever needed it, because I know what it is to need a place to stop and not find one. The fire crackled. Outside, the wind moved through the scrub oak. Evie was quiet for a moment. You take a real risk doing this, harboring people who are being pursued. I do, doesn't that worry you? Martha looked at her with a kind of patient clarity. What worried me more, she said, was the idea of sitting on something useful while people needed it. I've got walls and a roof and warmth and food enough to share. That's a resource. Sitting on resources while people suffer is its own kind of harm. She paused. Besides, worry never built anything. Gideon drank his coffee and listened. He'd met people like Martha Montgomery before. Not many, but a few, scattered across the territory. People who had survived things that would have broken most others and come out the other side not hardened but deepened, made more generous by the very experiences that could have made them less so. They were, he thought, the truest kind of strong. Martha fed them at midday. Venison stew, dense and good, with bread she'd baked that morning. She fed them without asking for thanks and without making ceremony of it. She just put food on the table and said, eat. 3 other people moved quietly through the way station. A young Shoshone man named Asa, who worked the stable and spoke little English, but communicated everything he needed to through gesture and expression. A woman named Bertie, somewhere around 60, who had come from Nebraska and was, as near as Gideon could determine, simply staying because she had nowhere else to go, and Martha had not asked her to leave. An older man named Clarence, who had a bad leg and a remarkable knowledge of edible plants, and who spent most of his time at the kitchen table identifying dried specimens and recording them in a notebook in extremely small handwriting. They were not related by blood, these 4 people. They had not come from the same place or lived the same life. They had ended up in the same location because the world outside had, in one way or another, decided they were inconvenient or surplus or invisible. And here they were, running a tight and functional household together, looking after each other's needs without making a performance of it. Evie watched them through the afternoon. She helped Bertie with the bread for the following day, because her hands were idle and idle hands bothered her, and she talked with Clarence about the plants while she worked the dough. She watched Asa move through the stable with complete competence, Merlin accepting his hands without hesitation. Gideon watched Evie watch them. She was learning something. He could see it on her face, the particular expression of a person taking in information that rearranges other things they already knew. She'd come from a homestead, a small operation, her father and brothers and herself, insular and self-sufficient in the way that frontier homesteads tended to be. The world she'd grown up in was made of small, separate units, each one guarding its own land and water and resources from the other units around it. This was different. This was something that operated on a different premise entirely. After supper, when Clarence had gone to bed and Asa had settled the horses, and Bertie had taken herself off to her corner of the house, Martha and Evie sat at the table together. Gideon was at the window, keeping an eye on the track through the dark. He could hear them talking. "How did you know?" Evie asked. "That you could build something like this? That it would work?" "I didn't," Martha said. "I just knew I had to try. Weren't you afraid it would fall apart?" The fear that something might fall apart is never a good enough reason not to build it. Martha poured the last of the coffee into Evie's cup. Everything on this earth can fall apart. The question is what you choose to build anyway. Evie turned the cup in her hands. "My father taught me to be self-sufficient," she said, "to rely on family and nobody else. He said the frontier would take everything from you if you let your guard down." "Your father wasn't entirely wrong," Martha said. "Self-sufficiency is real, and it matters. But there's a thing he might have missed." She looked at Evie directly. "When the world decides to come down on you, a single person's self-sufficiency has limits. What doesn't have limits is people who choose to stand together." Evie was quiet. "That's what Sterling is afraid of, I think," Martha went on. "Not any one family or any one piece of land. He's afraid of the thing that happens when enough people decide that their dignity is non-negotiable, and they're willing to stand next to each other in defense of it." She leaned forward slightly. "He takes people on one at a time because he knows that's the only way he can take them." Gideon at the window was still watching the track. Then he went still. Movement. South side of the yard, near the tree line. A shape, and then another. Then another. He turned from the window without making noise. "Martha," he said. His voice was quiet and flat, which was how she knew immediately. She stood up from the table. "How many?" she asked. "At least 4 from the south. Can't see the north side from here." He was already crossing to his coat, lifting the Colt from its holster. "Could be more on the perimeter." Evie was on her feet. She had the rifle in her hands, the one he'd given her to carry 2 days back. There was a sound from outside. Not a voice, not a call, just the sound of horses, several of them, moving into position around the property. Then a voice, cold, carrying, with the particular flat effect of a man who has no emotional stake in any particular outcome. "We know you're in there. We know who you're hiding. Come out with the girl and this ends clean. Jasper Kane." Gideon looked at Martha. She was already moving, calm and precise, pulling a second shotgun from behind the kitchen cabinet. She checked the loads and snapped it shut. "Back cellar," she said to Evie. "There's a door behind the woodpile inside. Stone steps, 6 of them, then a room. There's a second way, out through a tunnel that opens into the gully east of the stable. Asa knows it. I'm not leaving you in. Herewith, listen to me." Martha's voice was firm, but not sharp. She stepped up to Evie and put both hands on her shoulders and looked her straight in the eyes. "You getting captured does not help anyone. You have a job to do, and you cannot do it from the back of Kane's horse. Gideon and I can hold this." Evie looked at her, then at Gideon. He met her once. Evie's jaw set. She held Martha's gaze, and he could see her working through it, the frustration and the calculation, and the understanding that Martha was right. "Go," Evie said. "But I'm not leaving the territory. I'm not running." "I know you're not," Martha said. "Now move." Martha walked Evie quickly to the back of the house, showed her the cellar door, and was back in the main room in under a minute. Outside, Kane called again, louder this time, the patience in his voice wearing thin. Gideon was at the window. He could count 8 mounted men now in the yard and the tree line. Kane himself sat his horse in the center, 40 feet from the door. 8 against 2 was bad odds, but this was Martha Montgomery's house. And the 2 of them together had a particular advantage that 8 mounted men in the dark did not. Knew exactly where every piece of cover was. Martha moved to the east wall. She looked across at Gideon. "When the world outside strips you of your dignity," she said, and there was something in her voice that was both quiet and absolute, "this house will restore your honor." She was saying it to the walls as much as to him. She was saying it the way a person states a founding principle, the thing that everything else is built on. Gideon checked his loads. "You've done this before," he said. "Once," she said. We're still here. Outside, one of Cain's men dismounted and moved toward the door. Gideon tracked him through the gap in the shutter. The house held its breath, and Gideon raised the Colt. The first shot came through the shutter. Gideon dropped below the window line before the sound finished echoing across the yard. Splinters of the wooden frame fell around him. He heard Martha cross the room fast behind him, her boots on the floorboards, certain and deliberate. "East wall," she said. He moved to it, keeping low, putting the stone hearth between himself and the blown shutter. He could hear them outside now, the horses shifting, Cain's men repositioning in the dark. They'd fired to see what the house would do. They'd find out. Gideon took one breath. Then he came up over the windowsill and fired twice in quick succession at the nearest shape in the yard and dropped back down. A man went off his horse. That told Cain two things. The house was armed and the house was accurate, which meant Cain would stop probing and start pushing. Martha was at the back of the house. She raised her voice just enough to carry. "Evie, move! Now." There was a half-second pause, then the sound of the cellar door, the woodpile rattling as it was moved aside. Asa's voice, low and quick, guiding her down the stone steps. Gideon moved to the east wall and fired through the gap in the second shutter. Another shape in the yard pulled its horse back. He counted what he could see. 5, 6 riders. Maybe more on the north side he couldn't get eyes on. The man he'd dropped wasn't moving. Martha came back through and took position at the south window with a long-barreled shotgun. "The tunnel lets out into the creek gully," she said, watching the yard through the gap. "From there, it's the canyon, half a mile east. If she runs fast and runs now, she can get clear before they circle. They'll circle fast." "I know." He looked at her. She was watching the yard with the same level attention she'd shown when they rode up this morning. No fear visible. Or rather, the fear was there, but she'd put it where it belonged, somewhere below the functioning part of her mind, somewhere it couldn't interfere. Outside, Cain's voice cut through the dark again. "Last offer," he called. "The girl walks out, and everyone in that house sees tomorrow." Martha looked at Gideon. Gideon looked at the door. Then the south wall took 2 rifle rounds in rapid succession. The shots punching through the chinking between the logs and sending dust and dried mud across the floor. Martha didn't move. She waited. When the shape of a man appeared at the corner of the stable, she fired the shotgun through the window without ceremony, and the shape was gone. It went on like that for several more minutes. Steady, measured, each of them working their corners, managing their ammunition, making the house as expensive as possible to take. Gideon heard at least one more man go down. He heard Cain shouting orders he couldn't make out over the wind. Then the wind changed. He felt it first as pressure, a shift in the air, coming hard from the northwest, warm and dry, which was wrong for this country in this season, and which meant only one thing. Martha felt it, too. He saw her look up at the ceiling just briefly. "Canyon's going to be bad," she said. "I know," she said. "I'll hold them here long enough. I'm not leaving you with Gideon." Her voice was flat and final. "Evie needs you in that canyon. I need you to go." He held her gaze for 2 seconds. Then he went. He went out the back the same way Evie had, through the cellar door and down the 6 stone steps into the earth. The tunnel was narrow and low, packed dirt walls shored with rough timber, just wide enough to move through at a crouch. A candle stub was burning in a tin holder at the far end, where Asa had lit it. Gideon moved fast through the dark, one hand on the wall, hunched over. He came out into the creek gully through a wooden hatch, half buried in the bank. Cold air hit him, and with it, the first gust of what was coming. Evie was 20 yards ahead, Asa beside her, both of them moving east along the gully bottom. Gideon broke into a run. He reached them just as the dust hit. It came the way dust storms always came in canyon country, fast and total, and with no real warning, except that pressure change and that wrongness in the air. One moment the gully was dark but visible, the creek bank, the rocks, the scrub brush. The next moment the world turned brown and howling and blind. Asa grabbed Evie's arm. Gideon grabbed them both and pulled them against the creek bank, tucking in against the cut bank where the overhang gave a foot or two of shelter. The dust wasn't like rain. Rain was wet and heavy and fell down. Dust came sideways, from everywhere, filling the eyes and the nose and the throat, scouring exposed skin. He pulled his bandana up over his mouth and nose and kept his head down. He could hear Evie coughing beside him. "Stay close," he said, directly into her ear. "Hand on my belt and don't let go." He felt her hand close around his belt. He put his hand on Ass's shoulder. Then they moved, keeping the creek bank on their left for orientation, pushing east through the blinding brown howl. They made it maybe 200 yards. Then out of the dust, shapes appeared, 4 of them. Horses, moving in a line, blocking the gully east. The riders had cloth wrapped around their faces, and they moved with the careful confidence of men who knew where they were going, even when they couldn't see it. Cain had planned for the tunnel. He split his men before the shooting started. Gideon pushed Evie behind him and raised the colt. One of the riders swung down off his horse. Big man, unhurried in his movements. The kind of unhurried that had nothing to do with ease and everything to do with certainty. He unwrapped the cloth from his face and stood in the howling dust and looked at Gideon the way a man looks at a problem he's already solved. Jasper Cain. Gideon held the colt steady on him. Cain looked at the gun. He didn't reach for his own. He just looked at it, then at Gideon, and tilted his head slightly. "I've got 6 men behind you," Cain said. 3 ahead. "You shoot me, they'll cut all 3 of you down before the sound finishes." He paused. "I'm not here for you, Mercer. I'm here for the girl. Put the gun down, and you and the Indian walk out of this canyon. And if I don't?" Cain shrugged. "Same result. It just costs more on the way there." The dust screamed around them. Gideon kept the colt level. Then Cain reached into his coat pocket. He did it slowly with one finger and a thumb, making clear there was nothing dangerous in the movement. He produced a small object and held it out in his open palm, offering it for Evie to see. Evie had moved around to Gideon's left, not back behind him. He felt her go still beside him.
The object was a ring.
Gold, or gold-colored, heavy and old, with a flat signet face. Even in the dim, swirling brown of the storm, something about it caught the light. Evie stared at it. Cain watched her. "Recognize it?" Her voice came out quiet and strange. "That's my father's, it is." Cain closed his hand around it. "Jacob Thorne wore it for 15 years. Sterling gave it to him, back when they were doing business together." He let that sit for a moment, watching her face. "Ask yourself what kind of business a Wyoming rancher does with a territorial senator that earns a gold signet ring." "You're lying," Evie said. Cain put the ring back in his pocket. "Sterling says, bring you in. He didn't say anything about what I tell you on the way." He looked at her without cruelty, without particular satisfaction, just that flat and absolute attention. "Your father wasn't just a victim, Miss Thorne. Nobody in this story is just one thing." Gideon fired. Not at Cain. At the rider on the left, who'd been slowly moving his rifle up while Cain talked. The shot took the rifle out of his hands, and the man swore and pulled his horse back. Cain moved fast, faster than a big man had any right to, and then there was a gun against Gideon's ribs. Gideon kept the colt up. For 3 seconds, nothing moved in the howling storm, just the 2 of them, standing a foot apart. Guns pressed into each other's bodies, the dust screaming around them. Then a rifle cracked from the ridge above the gully. The shot hit Gideon high, on the left side of his chest. He heard it more than felt it, the flat, wet impact of it, and then the world tilted. His legs didn't buckle, not right away. He stayed upright for one long, terrible moment, the colt still in his hand, and he turned his head and looked at Evie. She was looking at him. Her face had gone white under the dust that covered it. He opened his mouth. The gully edge was 6 feet to his right. The river was below it. He'd known that. He'd clocked it when they came through. The Green Fork, running fast with snowmelt, loud enough that he'd heard it under the wind since they entered the canyon. deep and cold and fast. He made the decision in the split second before his legs gave. He threw himself toward the edge. He heard Evie shout his name. He heard Kane shout an order at the men on the ridge. Then the edge was under him and not under him, and there was cold air, and the roaring sound of water coming up fast, and the brown, swirling sky above him for one tilted, impossible moment. Then the river hit him like a wall of ice. The cold was absolute. It shut everything down. His body pulled in on itself. And the current grabbed him and pulled him under, and he couldn't tell which direction was up for a long, terrible second. His back hit a rock. His shoulder hit another. He fought toward the light. He got his face above the surface. He had one breath, one look back up the gully wall, one image of Evie at the edge, her face, before the current took him around the bend and out of sight. The river was deafening and dark and cold, beyond any cold he'd known. He let the current carry him and focused on breathing and staying conscious. On the gully edge above, Evie stood at the rim and stared at the river below. There was no sign of him, only the current, white and roaring and indifferent, breaking around the rocks. And then she saw it, his hat, black, wide-brimmed, circling slowly in an eddy downstream, caught in the current. It turned once, twice, and then the river pulled it under the bend and it was gone. She stood there for one moment that felt like it lasted a long time. Then Kane's hand closed around her arm. She fought. She fought hard, all of it, teeth and elbows and everything she had, and it wasn't enough. Kane was patient about it. He didn't hurt her unnecessarily. He just held on until she stopped, which she eventually had to, and then he put the iron shackles on her wrists and led her through the screaming brown storm toward the horses. She went. She had no other choice in that moment. But she looked back at the river once more, before the dust swallowed everything. She carried the image of that floating hat for every mile of the ride south through the storm. The outbuilding was stone and timber, with one window too high to reach, and a door that locked from the outside with a padlock. They'd brought her to Sterling's estate, east of Oakhaven, at some point in the night, though the hours had blurred together during the storm. She remembered the ride in pieces. The chains on her wrists, the horse under her, Kane riding ahead without speaking. The storm dying as they dropped out of the canyon country into the lower flatlands. Lamplight in windows. A gate. Gravel under the horse's hooves. The outbuilding was where they'd put her, dry and cold, with a cot and a tin bucket and a small oil lamp on a shelf that they'd left burning. Not out of kindness, just so she could see the walls. She lay on the cot in the dark of the second night and thought about Gideon. She thought about the river, the temperature of the water, which she could estimate from the nights they'd spent in the mountain country. Cold enough to stop a man's heart in 20 minutes if he couldn't get out. The current had been fast. There were rocks. She thought about the hat turning in the eddy. She pushed those thoughts back and replaced them with other ones. The practical ones, the ones that required her to be upright and functional and thinking. She'd learned from Gideon that despair was a luxury she couldn't afford yet. She had a locked door and a high window and chains on her wrists that were padlocked to a ring set in the floor beside the cot. She started going through her options the way he'd taught her to go through terrain. What did she have? What did she know? What was the most efficient route from where she was to where she needed to be? The door opened on the morning of the third day. A man came in first, heavyset, wearing the expensive suit of someone who'd spent time in eastern cities and wanted people to know it. His hair was gray and well-combed. His boots were polished. He had the large, confident manner of a man long accustomed to rooms rearranging themselves around his comfort. Senator Orson Sterling looked at her the way a man looks at a minor problem he intends to resolve before lunch. He pulled the chair from the corner and set it down in front of her and sat in it with the care of someone protecting the crease in his trousers. "Miss Thorne," he said. "I'm sorry for the circumstances," she said. Nothing. He seemed unfazed by that. He reached into his coat and produced two papers, folded neatly and opened them on his knee. The first document is a deed transfer for the Thorn water rights, signed over to the Sterling Land Trust in exchange for compensation at fair market value. It's a generous offer. He paused. The second is a sworn affidavit stating that your father, Jacob Thorn, was suffering from severe mental instability in the months preceding his death, that he had threatened violence against neighbors and family members, and that you believe he was responsible for the fire that destroyed the homestead and took the lives of himself and your brothers. He folded both papers and held them out to her. She looked at them, then at him. You want me to sign a statement saying my father burned his own house down with himself. And my brother's inside it, she said. It resolves several complications. My father was murdered by men you hired. Sterling put the papers on his knee and looked at her with the patient expression of a man who considers the truth to be a negotiable quality. Miss Thorne, he said, your father was not the man you think he was. His death is unfortunate. But the alternative to your signature is that you remain here. The Thorn land is absorbed into the trust through existing legal mechanisms, and you spend the considerable future answering questions about your own involvement in several incidents of property destruction and assault on officers of the law. He stood. He set the papers on the cot beside her and put a pen on top of them. I'll give you the day to think about it, he said. He said it pleasantly, which was somehow worse than if he'd said it with menace. He left. The lock clicked. She sat very still. She looked at the papers on the cot beside her. She thought about what it would mean to sign them, what it would mean for every family along the water rights corridor, what it would mean for every person Sterling would go after once he'd consumed the Thorn claim and moved on to the next one. She looked at the high window. The light through it was flat and gray. She thought about what Gideon had said in the trapper's cabin, the night he'd told her about the badge. The system was not the same thing as justice. The system was only working toward justice when the people inside it chose to make it so. That choice was real, and it had to be made actively, by real people at cost. She put the papers on the floor and put her foot on them. Then she started paying attention. The first servant came with food around midday. A woman, older, maybe 55, with a broad, quiet face and careful eyes. She set the plate down on the shelf next to the lamp and turned to leave without looking at Evie directly. Thank you, Evie said. The woman paused. She hadn't expected to be thanked. That was clear. She turned her head partway, not quite looking. I'm Evie, Evie said. What's your name? A long pause. Then, Clara, how long have you worked here, Clara? Clara glanced at the door. Long enough. Does he pay you fairly? Something moved in the older woman's face. She didn't answer. Evie studied her. Not with calculation, not the way you study a problem. With genuine attention, the kind that actually sees the person rather than their usefulness. She was looking at a woman who had spent years making herself invisible in this house, keeping her face neutral, moving through the rooms without disturbing anything, and she was looking at what that cost over time. I'm sorry, Evie said. That was a presumptuous question. You don't have to answer it. Clara looked at her directly for the first time. No, she said quietly. He doesn't. She left. She came back with supper. She set the plate down, and this time she stood for a moment with her back to the door. The man who brought you here, she said. Just above a whisper, the big one, Kane. He's gone north for 2 days. Mr. Sterling has a dinner this evening. He'll be occupied until late. She stopped. Her hands were still at her sides. Evie waited. There's a key, Clara said. She reached into her apron pocket. Her hand shook slightly, just slightly, as she set the key on the shelf beside the lamp. I don't know anything about any key. I don't know how it came to be in that room. She walked out. Evie sat very still for 3 seconds. Then she moved. The key fit the padlock on the chain to the floor. She got the chain off her wrists, which took longer because her hands were stiff and cold. She put her boots on and stood and went to the door and tried it. Still locked from outside. But there was a window in the door. Small, barred, but the bars were old and one of them had a wobble to it when she pushed it. She worked it back and forth for several minutes, her arms aching, and then it came free in her hands, and the gap was wide enough. It took her a while to get through it, her shoulders barely fitting, scraping skin off both arms. She landed in the dark exterior corridor, on her hands and knees, and crouched there listening. The estate was large. From what she'd seen being brought in, the main house was the big stone building to the north, maybe 60 yards from the outbuilding. There were lights in the windows, from the dinner Sterling had mentioned, horses in the stable to the east, 2 guards visible when she'd arrived, both stationed at the main gate, which was west. She went east. She found a side door into the main house, a servant's entrance that Clara had left unlatched, a supposition Evie made, and turned out to be right. Inside, the house was warm and lit, and she could hear voices from the front rooms, silverware, the murmur of formal dinner conversation. She moved through the back corridors. She found the study on her second attempt. The first door she tried was a bedroom. The second was a linen closet. The study was at the end of the back hallway, the door unlocked, the room dark. She lit the lamp on the desk down to the lowest possible light and looked around. The desk was massive, oak with a leather surface and a locking drawer set in the center. The lock was simple. She found a letter opener in the top drawer, worked it into the center drawer mechanism, the way she'd Eli do it once, to a tin lockbox they'd found in the barn, and the drawer came open. Inside was a ledger. Black leather, thick, with years written on the spine in gold ink, 15 years of entries. She carried it to the lamp. She read quickly. The early entries were in Sterling's handwriting, tight and precise. Land surveys, acquisition costs, dates of transactions. Ordinary enough, at first glance, but the names in the margins were not ordinary. She recognized 2 of them from a court case her father had mentioned. Once years ago, mentioned and then refused to discuss further when she'd pressed him. She kept reading. The entry she found was dated 15 years back, the winter of 1862. It was brief. A date, a location in the Wind River Basin, a description of acreage, and a payment recorded to a list of men identified only by initials. One set of initials was JT, Jacob Thorne. She read the surrounding entries. She read them twice, carefully, making sure she understood what she was looking at before she let herself react to it. The picture that assembled itself was this: 15 years ago, Sterling had wanted a particular tract of land in the Wind River Basin. The land was occupied by a Shoshone community that had held it for generations. Sterling had hired men to drive them off it, not through legal mechanisms, not through any process that left a record, but through force, through fire, through the particular frontier brutality that had no name in any law book because no one in power had ever seen fit to write it down. Jacob Thorne had been one of those men. He'd been paid well. The ledger recorded it. He'd been given the signet ring Kane now carried, a token of Sterling's appreciation, which was a thing Sterling apparently did with men he wanted to feel they were partners rather than employees. And then the years had passed, and Sterling had grown in wealth and power, and he'd decided to run for Senate, and the men who'd ridden for him 15 years ago had become a liability, living witnesses to something that could not come to light. So he'd removed them, one by one, or all at once, whichever was more efficient. The Thorne homestead had been all at once. Evie stood in the study with the ledger in her hands, and the lamp turned low, and the sound of dinner conversation filtering through the walls of the house. She felt the weight of it. Her father, who had built that homestead with his hands and worked it his entire adult life, and who she had loved in the complicated way of someone who was more respected than understood. Her father, who had been a hard man and a fair one by the measures she'd grown up with. Her father, who had done something unforgivable 15 years before she'd been old enough to understand the world. She stood with it. She didn't pretend it wasn't there. She didn't try to construct an argument that excused it or explained it away. She let it be true because it was true, and the truth deserved to be held plainly even when it was painful. But she also understood something else, something she'd been working toward without fully knowing it, since the night she'd crawled through burning grass with a wound in her side. Her father's actions were his. They were part of his story, and they were real, and they had caused real harm to real people. She could not unmake that. What she could do was refuse to let it define what happened next. Sterling had ordered her family killed, not as punishment for her father's past crimes, as housekeeping, as the removal of inconvenient witnesses before a Senate campaign. He had used her father's past complicity as a tool, and then he had discarded the tool when it was no longer useful, along with everyone connected to it. That was what she was fighting, not her father's legacy. Sterling's present and ongoing harm to anyone who stood between him and what he wanted. She could grieve her father's sins and still fight for justice. She could acknowledge the damage done to the Shoshone community 15 years ago and still stand up for the families Sterling was destroying today. Both things could be true at the same time. They had to be. She took the ledger. She also took several loose papers she found underneath it. Letters in Sterling's hand, correspondence with the Oak Haven Circuit Judge, correspondence with the County Marshal's office, payment records for services she was fairly certain weren't mentioned in any official record anywhere. She tucked them inside her shirt and put the ledger under her arm. She turned the lamp off. She stood in the dark study for a moment, listening to the dinner sounds, the clink of glasses, someone laughing at something Sterling had said. She thought about Gideon. She thought about him the way she had let herself think about him fully for the first time since they'd taken her. Not the hat in the river. Not that. She thought about him in the trapper's cabin, the badge on the table. The voice, plain and level and certain. "You're safe with me." She thought about what he would say if he were here. He would say, "Get out of the house first. Everything else comes after." She got out of the house. She moved through the servants' corridor and out the side door and across the dark yard. She found a horse in the stable that looked roadworthy, and she saddled it with hands that were steadier than she expected, and she led it quietly out the back gate, the one that was latched but not guarded. She mounted up. The road south toward Oak Haven lay ahead of her, pale in the thin moonlight. She had a ledger full of evidence, a head full of hard truths, and no idea whether the one person she most wanted to find was still alive. She had a choice about what she was riding toward. Revenge would be easy. Grief would be easier. Sterling had given her enough cause for both. She chose something harder. She kicked the horse forward and rode toward Oak Haven in the dark, not to burn anything down and not to settle anything personal, but to find a courtroom and a judge and enough good people to stand in that room and make the truth impossible to ignore. Her father's sins were his to answer for. Whatever reckoning awaited that part of the story, it was outside her hands. What was in her hands was the ledger pressed against her ribs, and the road ahead, and the choice she made with every mile to ride toward justice rather than away from it. She rode through the night and didn't stop. The river tried to kill him 4 times. The first time was the cold, which hit like a physical blow the moment the water closed over him and tried to lock his muscles up and pull him under. The second time was the rock he hit, broadside 10 seconds downstream, the impact driving the air out of him when he had precious little air to spare. The third time was a submerged log that caught his coat and held him under the surface for a long, terrible moment before the current tore him free. The fourth time was a slow section of water where the cold had gotten deep enough into him that his arms stopped working, and he began to sink with a strange and dreamy absence of urgency that he recognized from some distant professional part of his brain as the beginning of the end. He had one coherent thought in that moment. "You're safe with me." He'd said it to her. He'd meant it. And a man who made a promise in earnest had an obligation to survive long enough to keep it. He kicked. His legs barely responded. He kicked again, harder, fighting the dead weight of his own body. and got his face above the surface and got air in and held on. The riverbank appeared on his left. A gravel bar, low and flat, where the river swung east and slowed in the bend. He drove himself toward it with everything he had left, which wasn't much, and hit the gravel face first, and lay there with the cold water still running over his legs, while his lungs pulled in air in great ragged pulls. He stayed there for a long time. Then a pair of boots appeared in his field of vision. He looked up. The man standing over him was somewhere in his late 40s, lean and dark-eyed, with a thick mustache and a lawman's badge on his chest that caught the weak winter light. His horse stood behind him on the gravel bar, blowing hard from a recent run. He was looking down at Gideon with the expression of a man who has seen a great many things and has learned to take most of them in stride. "You are either very lucky or very determined," the man said. His voice carried a slight accent. The Spanish underneath the English, careful and precise, possibly both. Gideon got one arm under himself. "Marshal Hector Ruiz," the man said, crouching down to Gideon's level. "Out of the Oakhaven district." He studied Gideon's face. "You've been shot." "Aware of that. The wound is in your chest, left side high. Didn't go through the lung, or I wouldn't be talking to you." Ruiz looked at the bloodstain spreading through the wet fabric of Gideon's shirt and made his own assessment. "We need to move you. There's a line camp a mile east. Fire, and I have a medical kit that has kept worse men alive than this." "There's a woman," Gideon said. "Evie Thorne. Kane took her in the canyon." Ruiz's jaw set. "I know who Jasper Kane is. Do you know where he'd take her?" "Sterling's estate, east of Oakhaven." He paused. "I've been watching that estate for 8 months, Mercer. Building a case against Sterling that won't crumble the moment his lawyers touch it. I know his operation. I know his people." Another pause, heavier. "I've been watching and waiting, because I have seen what happens when a good man moves too fast against a powerful one without enough evidence to make it stick. The case collapses. The powerful man walks, and he spends the next 3 years making sure the good man wishes he'd stayed home." Gideon looked at him. "You know my name. I know your name. Deverer out of Rock Springs mentioned you to me 6 months ago. Said you were a man worth knowing if something needed doing in the Wind River country." Ruiz stood and offered his hand. "Can you stand?" He could, barely. Ruiz got him on the horse without ceremony, and they moved east through the cold. The line camp was a single room with a pot-belly stove that Ruiz had burning in 10 minutes. He was competent and efficient in the way of someone who had operated alone in difficult country for a long time. He got Gideon's coat and shirt off and looked at the wound with a critical eye and cleaned it and packed it and wrapped it tight. "The bullet went through," Ruiz said. "Exit wound in the back. Clean. Lucky or determined." He sat back. "The rib may be cracked. The lung is intact. You'll be in pain for several weeks. You will live." Gideon sat by the stove with the blanket around him and a cup of coffee in his hands and thought about the canyon, about Evie on the gully edge, about the hat in the current. "How long has Sterling been running this operation?" he asked. Ruiz poured his own coffee and sat across from him. 15 years of land acquisition through intimidation and violence. The last 3, he's moved toward official channels, the courts, the legislature, because he intends to run for a federal Senate seat, and he needs a clean face." Ruiz looked at him steadily. "He won't stop. The nature of that kind of ambition is that it doesn't stop. There is always one more piece of land, one more family to remove, one more witness to silence. We have a witness, Miss Thorne. Her testimony alone won't hold in a court. Sterling controls." "No," Ruiz agreed, "but I have 8 months of documented evidence. Interviews from 7 families who were displaced. Copies of falsified deed transfers. A letter, poorly destroyed, from Sterling to the county marshal regarding the disposal of the Thorne problem. He said it plainly, the way professionals say ugly things. I need a witness who was there. Miss Thorne is that witness." Gideon set the coffee down. He reached for his coat on the floor beside him, the wet and heavy thing, and dug into the breast pocket. The badge was still there, wet, tarnished, the bent point pressing into his palm when he closed his hand around it. He'd put it there in the trapper's cabin after Evie went to sleep. He'd told himself he was just carrying it. He hadn't told himself why. He looked at it now. Ruiz watched him without speaking. A man who threw away his principles because a broken institution had betrayed them was letting the institution win twice. He'd understood that in the trapper cabin, sitting across the fire from Evie Thorne, understanding a thing and acting on it were two different steps, and the second step was the one that cost something. He pinned the badge to his dry shirt, the one Ruiz had found in the line camp stores. The bent point made the pinning awkward. He got it straight. He looked at Ruiz. How many men does Sterling have at the estate? Normally, 4. With Kane there, likely 8. Ruiz studied him. You can barely stand. I can sit a horse. You have a cracked rib and a bullet wound. I have a promise to keep. He met the marshal's eyes. Are you going to help me or tell me about my ribs? Ruiz was quiet for a moment. Then he stood up and put his coat on. All right, he said, but we do this correctly. No shooting unless fired upon first. We go in as officers of the law, with warrants, and we bring Miss Thorne out through the proper process. Agreed. And if Kane draws on us, Gideon stood up, carefully, and reached for his gun belt. Then we stopped talking about the proper process. They rode south. The rain started somewhere around midday, a cold, steady fall that turned the road to mud and soaked through their coats within the hour. Gideon rode with one hand on the reins and one arm held close to his body, managing the pain in his chest, with the focused attention of a man who has decided that the pain is simply a feature of the current situation and not a deciding factor. Ruiz rode beside him and briefed him on the layout of the Sterling estate as they went. The main house, the outbuilding where they kept people they didn't want in the main house, the gate and the guard positions. They came over the last rise above the estate in the late afternoon. The main gate was open. Ruiz pulled his horse up and looked at the open gate and then at Gideon. A figure was coming up the road toward them through the rain. On horseback, moving at a steady trot, a horse Gideon didn't recognize. The rider's posture was straight despite the rain and the dark and whatever had happened in the hours since the canyon. When she was 50 yards out, she pulled her horse up and stared at him. Evie Thorne. She was soaked through. Her hair was down and dark with rain. She had a ledger book tucked under one arm, held against her body, to protect it from the wet. She was wearing the same torn dress she'd had on in the canyon, with a man's heavy coat over it that she'd clearly taken from wherever she'd been held. There were scraped marks on both her forearms. She looked at him, at the badge on his chest, at the sling Ruiz had fashioned for his left arm. She said absolutely nothing for a long moment. Then she said, "You're alive, more or less." She pushed her horse forward the remaining distance and pulled up beside him and looked at the badge first, then at his face, studying him the way she studied everything, with that direct and unhurried attention. "You're shot," she said. "High and through." Ruiz patched it. She looked at Ruiz. "You're the marshal, Hector Ruiz." He tipped his hat, a formal gesture made slightly absurd by the rain streaming off its brim. "I've been building a case against Sterling for the better part of a year, Miss Thorne. I'm glad to find you upright and mobile." "I escaped," she said. Then she held up the ledger. "And I found this." Gideon looked at it. "His ledger," she said. 15 years of transactions. Names, dates, payments, all of it." She said the next part steadily, without breaking. "My father's initials are in it. He worked for Sterling 15 years ago. I need you to know that before we go any further, because it will come out, and I won't hide it." Gideon held her eyes. "Does it change what we're doing?" he asked. "No," she said. "It changes some of what I thought about my father. It doesn't change Sterling's crimes." He nodded. "Then we ride to Oak Haven." The rain came down harder. Somewhere behind them, The Sterling estate sat quiet with its gate open and its outbuilding empty. He looked at her across the space between the horses, and she looked back at him, and the rain ran down both their faces. He closed the distance between them, and she met him halfway, and there in the cold, muddy road in the driving rain outside Sterling's estate, he cupped her face in his free hand and kissed her. She kissed him back, fully, directly, without hesitation. When they separated, the rain was still falling, and Ruiz was looking at his horse's ears with diplomatic attention. "We bring him down with the truth," Gideon said, "and the law. No shortcuts, no shortcuts," she agreed. She tucked the ledger more firmly under her arm and turned her horse south. "Then let's go," she said. The rain didn't stop. It fell through the night, and it was still falling when they rode into Oakhaven at first light. The town was gray and wet, the main street empty, except for a dog moving under the boardwalk, and a man emptying slop from a second-floor window who didn't look up as they rode past. The courthouse sat at the north end of the main street, a two-story stone building with heavy oak doors and a flagpole above the entrance from which the territorial flag hung sodden and still in the wet air. They had ridden through the night, the three of them, stopping twice to water the horses, and once to let Gideon rest against a tree for 20 minutes because his face had gone the color of old candle wax. And Ruiz had insisted. They had not been alone by morning. Martha Montgomery had found them at the edge of town. Gideon didn't know how. He suspected Asa, who had more knowledge of the back roads in this country than most people knew existed. Martha rode up out of the gray dawn on a solid roan mare with Asa beside her and Bertie sitting straight-backed behind him on a second horse, which was a remarkable sight. Behind them, on foot and on horseback, came others. 7 homesteading families from the river corridor who had received Sterling's lawyers on their doorsteps, and who had talked to Ruiz in the preceding months, and who had apparently decided that this particular morning was the one to act on everything they'd said. A Shoshone elder named Washaki's cousin, whose family had been directly affected by the 1,862 land seizure recorded in the ledger, and who Ruiz had contacted 2 nights back by a method he didn't explain. 3 men from the local freedmen's community east of town who knew Martha and who had their own list of grievances against Sterling's land operations. They came together on the South Road into Oakhaven in the early morning rain, quietly, without ceremony, the way people come together when they have individually decided that they have had enough and have found that others have decided the same thing at the same time. Evie looked at them as they assembled. She thought about what Martha had said at the way station. Sterling is afraid of the thing that happens when enough people decide their dignity is non-negotiable and they're willing to stand next to each other in defense of it. They were standing next to each other. She turned and rode toward the courthouse. Inside, Sterling was already there. Ruiz had confirmed it through the clerk, who met him at the door, a young man who looked at the assembled crowd with wide eyes, and then at Ruiz's badge, and said nothing. Sterling had filed the final paperwork for the Thornland forfeiture 2 days ago, moved up from the original date, moving fast the way powerful men move when they sensed something closing in. Proceedings were scheduled for 9 in the morning. It was 8:30. They gave Sterling the half hour. Gideon used it to get Ruiz's warrants in order. Ruiz had them, properly drawn, signed by a judge in the neighboring district who owed Sterling nothing, and who had been quietly reviewing Ruiz's documented evidence for 3 weeks. Gideon read them through once, checking the language, then handed them back. They were solid. Outside the courthouse doors, Evie stood in the rain with the ledger in her hands and looked at the people gathered behind her. Martha stood near the front, her shotgun left at the horses, her hands empty and her shoulders level. Asa beside her. The homesteading families behind them, men and women both, several with children who stood quiet and serious in the rain. The Shoshone elder. The 3 men from the freedmen's community, all of them wet and cold and present. She thought about what this had cost each of them to show up here on this morning in this town. Sterling's name was a weight that people in this territory had been living under for years. It pressed down on decisions, on what you said and where you went and who you stood next to in public. Showing up here, in front of this building, was a statement that couldn't be taken back. They'd made it anyway. She looked at Gideon. He was pale but upright, the badge straight on his chest, his right hand loose at his side. He looked at her and nodded once. She faced the doors. She pushed them open and walked in. The courtroom was warm and lit and smelled of wood oil and paper. The judge's bench was occupied by a man in his 60s with small eyes and the careful posture of someone who has spent years trying to seem neutral while being anything but. Sterling sat at the respondent's table with two lawyers and Jasper Kane standing behind him, and two of Kane's men at the back wall. Sterling turned at the sound of the doors. He looked at Evie. He looked at the people filing in behind her, the homesteaders, Martha, the Shoshone elder, the Freedmen's community members, filling the gallery benches, standing along the walls. His face went through something. The composed, powerful expression he'd maintained through her captivity shifted, just briefly, before he pulled it back. Evie walked down the center aisle. She was soaked from the rain. Her boots left wet prints on the wood floor. She held the ledger against her chest with both arms, and she walked to the front of the room, without looking left or right, and stopped at the judge's bench. She put the ledger on it. "What is the meaning of this?" the judge said. "My name is Evelyn Thorne," she said. "The proceeding you're about to conduct concerns my family's land and water rights. I have a direct legal interest in this matter, and I am here to present evidence relevant to how this court should rule on it." Sterling's lawyer was already on his feet. "Your Honor, this woman is a fugitive from—" "She is a witness," Ruiz said. He was standing at the back of the courtroom, badge visible, Gideon beside him. "And I am Marshal Hector Ruiz of this district, operating under warrants signed by Judge Elias Crane of the neighboring district, and I have business with Senator Sterling that supersedes whatever is on your docket this morning." The courtroom was very quiet. The judge looked at Ruiz, at the warrants Ruiz held up, at the crowd in the gallery. Sterling looked at the ledger on the bench. Evie watched his face. She saw him understand what it was. She saw the calculation happen fast behind his eyes. She saw him decide something. He looked at Kane. Kane moved. Gideon moved faster. He crossed the distance between the back wall and Kane in 3 strides and caught Kane's gun hand before the draw was complete, and the two of them stood locked there for one still second. Then Ruiz was beside them with his own gun drawn, and Kane let go, and the room shifted again. Kane's men at the wall, looking at Ruiz and at the homesteading men, who had quietly stood up from the gallery benches and were standing between them and the door. Kane stepped back. Sterling's lawyer sat down. The judge looked at the ledger. Evie turned to face the courtroom. The gallery was full. Every face was watching her. She looked at them, the homesteading families, Martha, the elder, the people who had come through rain and risked to stand in this room. She looked at Sterling, who was watching her with the flat attention of a man trying to calculate what the next move was. She spoke. "My father was wrong in his past, and he paid for it with his life." She let that stand for a moment in the quiet room. But that does not give Senator Sterling the right to use his power to trample over the law, human dignity, and the right to live for anyone on this frontier. The room was absolutely still. "That ledger on the judge's bench contains 15 years of Senator Sterling's business," she went on. "It records payments made to men to drive families from their land. It records falsified deed transfers. It records hush payments to officers of the court. It records, in his own hand, the planning and financing of acts of violence against homesteaders, against indigenous communities, against anyone who stood between him and what he wanted." She looked at Sterling directly. "My father's initials are in that ledger. I am not here to excuse what he did. I am here to make sure that the man who orchestrated it and who ordered my father and my brothers killed. To keep it quiet faces the same law that applies to everyone else in this territory. Sterling's jaw was tight. His lawyers were bent together, whispering. The families in this courtroom, Evie said, have names and legal standing and the same right to this territory's protection as any wealthy man sitting at any table in any courtroom in this country. That right doesn't diminish because a powerful man decides it's inconvenient. It doesn't expire because the legal system has been arranged to ignore it. She picked up the stack of loose papers she'd carried in alongside the ledger and laid them on the bench beside it. These are letters in Sterling's own hand, payment records, correspondence with this court's officers. She stepped back. I leave it to this court to do what courts are supposed to do. The judge picked up the ledger. He opened it. He read for 2 minutes in the silence of the room. Then he looked at Sterling over the top of his glasses for a long moment. Sterling looked back at him. The judge looked back at the ledger. Marshal Ruiz, he said, you said you have warrants. I do, Your Honor. Then I suggest you execute them. Sterling stood up. Ruiz crossed the room. The courtroom erupted, not in violence, in sound, the sound of people who have been holding something tightly for a long time and have just felt it release. The homesteading families were on their feet. Someone in the back of the gallery shouted something in Shoshone that the elder translated for no one in particular, but smiled while doing it. Martha Montgomery stood with her arms crossed and her head up, watching Sterling's face with the expression of a woman who has been waiting for something for a long time and recognizes it now that it's here. Kane didn't run. He stood and let Ruiz's deputy, who had come in through the side door at a prearranged time, put the irons on him. He looked at Evie while it happened. His face was its usual flat nothing. Then he looked at the floor and stayed quiet. Sterling, in the end, came apart more than Kane did. He said several things while Ruiz was putting the irons on him, things about power and influence, and what would happen to everyone in this room when this was over. Nobody in the room changed their expression. Gideon stood at the back of the courtroom and watched it all with the particular stillness of a man who has reached the end of a long road and is taking a moment to understand that he's actually there. Evie found him by the back wall when it was done. She stood beside him, and they watched the courtroom continue its eruption together, not speaking. After a while, she said, "It worked. It worked," he said. She looked at the badge on his chest. "Suits you." He looked at her. She had dried out slightly in the warmth of the courtroom, though her dress was still damp and her hair was still down. She had a long scrape on her left arm from whatever she'd done to get out of that outbuilding. She looked tired and real, and under all of it, something else that he recognized as the look of a person who has done something they believed in and knows that it mattered. He put his arm around her shoulders, gently on the right side where nothing hurt. She leaned against him for a moment. That was all. The courtroom went on around them, loud and alive, and they stood at the back of it together and let the moment be what it was. Outside, through the heavy windows, the rain was finally stopping. Spring came to Wyoming the way it always did. Not politely, not all at once. It argued with winter for several weeks, giving ground and taking it back, the cold returning for days at a time before retreating again. But by May, the argument was settled. The snow on the lower slopes had gone to mud and then to grass, and the grass had come up green and thick all the way down to the creek banks. And the Wind River country looked the way it looked for maybe 6 weeks out of every year, which was like someone had set out to make the most beautiful place on earth and had largely succeeded. The Thorn water rights had been legally restored in March by order of the district court, along with a formal notation in the record that the original deed had been improperly obtained through fraudulent means. Evie had spent the weeks after the trial working with Ruiz on the documentation. The case against Sterling was being built in layers, the territorial charges first, the federal ones to follow. It would take time. The lawyers Sterling had hired were skilled, and the process of dismantling 15 years of embedded corruption was exactly as slow and difficult as Gideon had warned her it would be. But the ledger was in evidence. The letters were in evidence. The families whose testimony Ruiz had gathered over 8 months were on record. It was real and it was moving. She'd had one afternoon in February when she sat alone in the small room she'd rented above the Oakhaven General Store and held her father's memory in her mind and let herself grieve him properly. The complicated version of him. The man who'd worked himself raw to build something in this country and who had made a terrible choice at a moment of moral weakness and who had spent 15 years carrying the weight of it without ever speaking of it. She grieved that man. She grieved the boys she'd grown up with. She let herself do it fully, without rushing it. Then she got up and went back to work. The water rights question was the one she'd thought hardest about. She'd ridden out to the Shoshone Reservation, east of the Wind River Range in early April, with Ruiz as interpreter for the formal parts, and had sat in council for 2 days with the community leaders whose families had been driven from the land in 1862. She had told them what she knew, what the ledger recorded, what her father had done. She said it plainly without softening it, because they deserved plain truth more than they deserved her comfort. They'd listened. Then they'd talked among themselves for a long time. What emerged from those 2 days was an agreement that took the Thorn water rights and folded them into a shared covenant. The creek that ran through the Thorn land became communal ground. The homesteading families along the corridor could draw from it under terms agreed on in council. The reservation community had first access rights during the dry months, restoring what had been taken from them, partially, imperfectly, but as a beginning. There were legal mechanisms required, and Ruiz spent considerable time on them. Evie signed everything in front of a notary in Oakhaven on a Thursday morning in late April with the spring sun coming through the window. The notary asked her if she was certain. She told him she'd been certain since February. Gideon had his own work. Ruiz had offered him the deputy marshal position formally in January. He'd accepted it informally in January and formally in February. On the day the paperwork came through from the territorial government, which was 2 weeks after the informal acceptance, but before the notary could be scheduled. He spent March and April on horseback, riding the district. Ruiz worked Oakhaven and the southern settlements. Gideon worked the river corridor and the mountain country he knew better than anyone in the territory. He made himself visible in the places where Sterling's operation had made itself visible before. He talked to homesteaders and to the reservation communities and to the freedmen's settlement east of town. He listened more than he talked. He pinned the tarnished badge on every morning. He'd had a smith look at the bent point and the rusted pin. In February, the smith had offered to replace it with a new one. He'd said no. The cabin on the hill above the creek had been Evie's idea. She'd picked the site in March, standing in knee-deep mud on the slope above the north bank, pointing at a flat place where the ground leveled off and a stand of cottonwoods caught the afternoon sun. She'd said it had good drainage and a sight line down the valley in both directions and enough flat ground for a kitchen garden. She hadn't mentioned any of the other reasons. Gideon had known all of them anyway. They built it through April and into May, with help from Asa and from 2 of the homesteading families from the corridor who had timber skills and who came out on weekends because they wanted to, and not because anyone had asked them to. Martha rode up one Saturday with Bertie and Clarence and spent the day doing the window casings, which were plumb and properly fitted and better than anything Gideon could have managed. By the end of May, the cabin was solid and tight. 2 rooms, a stone hearth in the main room, a kitchen with a proper iron stove, 2 windows that faced south to catch the light. Evie moved in on a Saturday in early June. She had, in total, 1 bag of clothes, a set of cooking tools, 3 books, and a battered tin coffee pot that had survived everything, and she was not about to leave it behind. Gideon moved in 2 days later. He had a saddlebag, his bedroll, his gun rig, the box of cartridges, and a deputy marshal's commission in a leather folder. He also had at the bottom of the saddlebag a candle stub from a trapper's cabin in the Wind River foothills, and a strip of linen from a field dressing he'd done in the dark beside an oak tree on an autumn night. He didn't explain why he'd kept them. He didn't need to. The summer evenings came long and warm in the valley. After supper, they tended to end up on the porch or near the hearth, depending on whether the evening air was still too cold, which in June it sometimes was. They read, or talked about the work, or sat quietly, which was something they'd both always been comfortable with. Gideon liked the quiet evenings best. He liked watching Evie read, the way she turned pages, and sometimes stopped and went back, and sometimes put the book face down on her knee and looked out the window at the valley below them, thinking something through. He liked that she was always thinking something through. He liked that she told him what she was thinking when she'd finished working it out, not before, because she'd figured out that he was the same way, and they'd arrived without discussion at the mutual understanding that silence in each other's company was not distance. On an evening in late June, when the light was going gold over the valley, and the creek was audible through the open south window, and the fire had burned down to red coals. In the hearth, Evie set her book on the table and shifted on the bench until she was beside him. She rested her head against his chest. He put his arm around her. They sat like that for a while, listening to the creek and the fire and the evening wind through the cottonwoods outside. Then she spoke quietly into the warm air of the room. I never thought lying beside a man could feel so peaceful. He looked down at the top of her head, the dark hair dried in the warmth of the fire. He thought about a trapper's cabin in a blizzard, a narrow cot, a bearskin quilt, a young woman saying something true and undefended in the dark. He thought about all the miles between that night and this one. He kissed her forehead, gently, and he held her closer and spoke into her hair. "You're not just safe, Evie," he said. "You are my home." Outside, the valley lay green and wide and quiet under the last of the evening light. The creek ran bright over its stones, carrying water down to the shared land below where it spread out across the corridor and gave itself to everyone who needed it. Somewhere on the eastern slope, a wolf called once, far away and clear, and the mountains answered it with silence. The fire burned low. They stayed. So that's where we leave Evie and Gideon. A new cabin on a hill. A shared creek running down to communal land. A tarnished badge that never got replaced. And two people who found each other, not through convenience or comfort, but through the hardest miles either of them had ever ridden. But here's what I want you to sit with before you close this out. This story was never really about the romance. The romance was the reward at the end of something much more difficult. What this story was actually about is the question every one of us faces at some point in our lives when the world strips something from you: your safety, your family, your belief in the system, your idea of who your father was. What do you choose to do next? Evie Thorne lost everything in a single night, and she didn't collapse into revenge. She didn't disappear quietly. She got up and walked toward the hardest thing she could imagine. Not because it was safe, but because she decided that letting injustice go unanswered was its own kind of surrender. That took more courage than any gunfight in this story. Gideon carried guilt for 5 years over a decision he made in good faith that went terribly wrong. And the lesson he learned, the one that cost him half a decade of wandering, is one worth saying plainly. Believing in justice and blindly trusting a broken institution are not the same thing. Justice has to be built. It doesn't just exist. It requires people who are willing to step back into the difficult work, even after the system has already failed them once. Martha Montgomery built something real out of nothing but will and principle. She didn't wait for the world to be fair before she started acting fairly. She looked at what she had: 4 walls, a warm fire, enough food, and she decided that holding on to it while others suffered was its own kind of harm. That is a radical idea. It is also a profoundly simple one. And then there is the question of Evie's father, because this story didn't let Jacob Thorne be only a victim, and it didn't let Evie pretend otherwise. His sins were real. The harm he caused was real, and Evie had to hold that truth in one hand and her own integrity in the other, and decide they were two separate things. That is one of the hardest things a person can do. Love someone honestly, see them clearly, and still choose to be better than the worst they did. The frontier in this story is a place, but it's also a mirror. The questions it asks about power, about dignity, about who the law actually protects and who it discards are not questions from 1877. They are questions from every era, including this one. What do you choose to build when what you had is gone? Who do you stand next to when standing there costs you something? And when the world tells you to disappear quietly, what do you say back? Evie Thorne said, "Not yet. I hope you carry a little of that with you." This story is a work of historical fiction created for entertainment and storytelling purposes. All characters, events, and locations are fictional and do not represent any real individuals or historical occurrences.